Over 11,000 years ago, long before cities, long before writing, or even agriculture as we know it, a group of prehistoric people gathers on a hilltop in what is now southern Turkey. With only stone tools at their disposal, they carve and erect towering stone pillars in carefully arranged circles. These people are nomadic hunter-gatherers, yet here they are, constructing a massive monumental complex. This is Göbekli Tepe, often hailed as the world's oldest known temple site, dating back to the very dawn of the Neolithic era. Its discovery in the 1990s stunned archaeologists and historians and overturned long-held assumptions about the origins of civilization. But how and why would societies with no farms or cities build such a place out of nowhere? Good question. That's what we're here to talk about. Göbekli Tepe. It's a fascinating glimpse into humanity's earliest experiments with monumental architecture and the ritual of community. So we'll do our best to shed some light on what Göbekli Tepe actually is. Of course, we're relying on the newest research we have as of 2025. Hopefully nothing changes too much between now and then, but who knows what we're going to pull out of the ground. In any case, allow me to welcome you to the video first. If you are here for the first time, it's good to meet you. And if you're coming back, then you know what I'm about to say. And that is that this video is completely devoid of mid-roll ads, because we hate ads, just like you, so relatable. So we prefer to be funded by the Patreon, the YouTube members, the occasional donation on PayPal, and YouTube Super Thanks. And we've also got a merch store. You can find all those links in the pinned comment, the video and channel description. But really the best thing you can do for us is give a like, subscribe, share the video around, and just tell your friends. And a little comment below always helps with the algorithm. You know what it's like. In any case, welcomes and introductions out of the way, let's go back in time to Göbekli Tepe. Göbekli Tepe was hidden for thousands of years beneath a mound on a ridge overlooking the Harran Plain in southeastern Turkey. That's what Turkey calls their country now, by the way. Now, what about the name Göbekli Tepe? Well, in Turkish it means pot-belly hill. It's a reference to its rounded silhouette. Locally, the hilltop hosted only a lone mulberry tree, a wishing tree adorned with cloth ribbons by villagers, perhaps hinting at the lingering aura of sanctity. And the modern world took very little notice of this hill. That was until the late 20th century. In 1963, a joint University of Chicago and Istanbul University survey briefly noted the site. Surveyors observed flint flakes and some limestone slabs on the surface, and they assumed that they were the remnants of some forgotten medieval cemetery. With that mistaken identification, further investigation was shelved. The true significance of the flints and stone fragments lay unrealized. The truth was buried. But that was until 1994, when Göbekli Tepe's importance was finally recognized, almost by pure luck. We meet the main character now, Klaus Schmidt, a German archaeologist who had worked on Neolithic sites in the region. He came across the old survey mention of stone slabs at Göbekli Tepe, and this was quite curious. He visited the site himself in person. Now, at first glance, the hilltop seemed pretty unremarkable. Patches of reddish soil, piles of field stones cleared by local farmers, no visible architecture at all. But Schmidt was an archaeologist, and as he walked around the mound, he noticed the ground glittering with an unusual abundance of flint chips. It was as if the entire hill was covered in stone tools. Now this was a telltale sign of Stone Age activity. Among the rubble, he spotted something even more astonishing. A large T-shaped block of limestone peeking out of a clearing pile, and it was remarkably similar to the pillars he had seen at other Neolithic sites, such as Navali Kori, that contained T-shaped pillars. So it was in that moment that Schmidt realized this hill concealed something quite extraordinary. He later recalled, only man could have created something like this, as he immediately recognized the fragments and prehistoric sculptures rather than tombstones. And just like that, Göbekli Tepe had been rediscovered. Excavations began in 1995 under the direction of Schmidt himself, in collaboration with the local museum. What they found would revolutionize our understanding of prehistory, for just beneath the surface, they uncovered the tops of massive stone pillars arranged in circles. As digging continued, it became clear that this was no cemetery, nor was it a simple village, nor was it medieval. There were no traces of houses, no hearths, or even everyday domestic life. Instead, the team exposed finely crafted megaliths, some up to 5 meters tall, many adorned with mysterious relief carvings of animals and abstract symbols. And so, layer by layer, ring after ring, these pillars emerged. Archaeologists had stumbled upon a Neolithic monumental sanctuary of immense scale, built over 11,000 years ago. Of course, news like that spreads quickly, and Göbekli Tepe was soon hailed as one of the most important archaeological finds of modern times. It pushed back the timeline of large-scale human architecture by thousands of years, to a period when our ancestors were thought to be just simple nomads. The significance of Göbekli Tepe cannot be overstated. Here we had the site, dating to roughly 9600 BCE, several millennia before Stonehenge or the Egyptian pyramids. Well, where presumably primitive hunter-gatherers had mobilized later to erect great stone monuments. It was, in Schmidt's words, a cathedral on a hill, built by people who had not yet developed agriculture or even pottery. Certainly the cart before the horse, but they hadn't even developed the cart yet. Well, its existence challenged the conventional narrative that civilization, that is settled villages, agriculture, complex society, had to come first before humans could afford the luxury of constructing temples or monuments. Göbekli Tepe suggested the opposite, that communal ideology and ritual gatherings may have been a driving force that led humans toward civilization. Little wonder that archaeologists and historians suddenly looked at this region, the upper Mesopotamian foothills, with fresh eyes, and asked the question, could it be that the road to civilization began with spiritual and social unity rather than economic necessity? Göbekli Tepe placed us at the threshold of that pivotal transition in our history, and that's what makes it so uniquely precious, a window into the human past. Of course, the human past, one thing to talk about that when we think about things like the Bronze Age, but with Göbekli Tepe, here we are, around the end of the last Ice Age, around 10,000 BCE, that is the late Epi-Paleolithic to the pre-Pottery Neolithic period. Global climates were warming and stabilizing after a millennia of glaciation. In the Fertile Crescent, the broad region curving from Anatolia through Levant, wild plant and animal life was abundant. Göbekli Tepe sits at the northern edge of this fertile crescent, on a limestone plateau some 15 kilometers from the present city of Sanliurfa, or in ancient words, Urfa. Well, today the area is semi-arid, largely treeless, but 11,000 years ago it was quite a bit more inviting. So we should imagine with the eyes of our ancestors a landscape of patchy woodlands, open steppes, with herds and gazelles roaming, wild cattle called aurochs, and wild boar in the brush, flocks of wild sheep and goats on the hill slopes, and wetlands along seasonal streams attracting migratory birds, sands of wild cereals, einkorn and emmer wheat, barley too. They grew on the hillsides alongside stands of wild pistachio and almond trees. Klaus Schmidt described the environs of the prehistoric Göbekli Tepe as a paradise for hunter-gatherers, a land of plenty where groups could gather and feast upon wild game, grains, and fruits. This period in time marks the threshold between a purely foraging way of life and the beginnings of farming. Scholars call it the pre-pottery Neolithic, or PPN, because people had begun building permanent structures and experimenting with cultivation, yet pottery technology had not quite yet been invented. Göbekli Tepe dates mainly to the PPN-A and PPN-B periods, so we're talking 9600 to 8000 BCE. This was an age of great change. Sedentary village life was just taking root in some areas, and the domestication of the first crops and livestock would follow within a few centuries. But crucially, at the time Göbekli Tepe's earliest monuments were built, its builders were still hunter-gatherers. They had no metal tools, relying on flint and obsidian blades and bone implements, and they had no draft animals, no wheeled transport. Whatever they built or carried was accomplished with human ingenuity, and no doubt quite a bit of muscle. Their communities were likely small, mobile bands, periodically coming together for joint efforts or ceremonies. And so in this context, building anything massive or permanent was a bold departure from the norm. Typically, foragers led relatively mobile lives, and their structures, huts or temporary camps, were modest. Yet, at Göbekli Tepe, these people undertook a true project of monumental scale. The site's placement is also intriguing. You see, it lies on the highest point of a mountain ridge, visible for many kilometers around. The choice of a conspicuous hilltop suggests a deliberate concern with visibility, perhaps even a spiritual geography. High places are often associated with ritual significance, and indeed Göbekli Tepe's skyline's position would have been making it a natural beacon for groups converging from different areas. But we should also note that Göbekli Tepe did not exist in isolation. The Neolithic communities of Upper Mesopotamia were interconnected. Just 20 miles away, for example, archaeologists later found early evidence of cultivated wheat at a site of called Karaka Dag, in the Karaka Dag foothills, rather. They've been identified with a locus of einkorn wheat domestication around 8500 BCE. Now, south of Göbekli Tepe, in what is now Syria, sites from the same era, such as Jurf El Amar and Tel Göbekli's contemporaries, show communal buildings and symbolic art as well. In the upper Euphrates and Tigris regions, a cultural horizon was emerging in which people experimented with architecture and symbolism, even before full farming economies. Göbekli Tepe was perhaps the most flamboyant expression of this horizon, a regional gathering place for peoples of the northern Fertile Crescent, set just as they stood on the brink of agricultural revolution. So let's talk a bit more about the site and its architecture in general. The site today appears as an artificial mound about 50 meters high, 300 meters in diameter, capping the limestone plateau. The mound is entirely the product of human activity. Layer upon layer of constructions and debris accumulated over many centuries of use. Excavations have revealed that the site has a stratified sequence of building phases, conventionally divided into at least 2 main levels. Archaeologists refer to these as Layer 3, the oldest, Layer 2, slightly later, with a thin Layer 1 representing the topsoil and rubble that had buried the site until its modern discovery. So let's start with Layer 3, and this is circa 9600 to 8800. It's the earliest and, frankly, most impressive phase. It features the famous circular or oval enclosures with the massive T-shaped stone pillars. So far, several of these monumental enclosures have been excavated, labeled enclosures A, B, C, and D, etc. Creative. And radar surveys indicate there are many more still underground. Each enclosure is roughly 10 to 30 meters across. The largest uncovered is about 20 meters in diameter and built of stone. This design is broadly consistent, a ring of T-shaped monolithic pillars set vertically around the perimeter, often connected by low stone walls, and 2 larger freestanding T-pillars erected in the center of the space. And the pillars are huge, some standing 5 to 5.5 meters tall, and that's about 16 to 18 feet, and weighing on the order of 7 to 10 tons or more. They were carved from local limestone bedrock, and then transported a short distance and erected in prepared sockets on the floor. The enclosures had stone, bench-like structures along their inner walls, perhaps to accommodate participants in some kind of religious rites. The floors of these structures were made of hard-packed lime terrazzo or bedrock, sometimes burnished. Notably, no doorway entrances have been found for these round buildings. Possibly they were entered from above via ladder or a narrow opening, or perhaps they were only used in an open roof context. Now, Layer 2 is around 8800 to 8000. In a later period after the heyday of the big circles, people continued to use Göbekli Tepe, but in a different way. Layer 2 features smaller buildings, some of which are rectangular or semi-rectangular in plan, much like smaller T-shaped pillars, often under 2 meters high, embedded in their walls. These resemble the structures found in early Neolithic village sites of the region. It seems that as time went on, the grand circles were backfilled and abandoned, and new buildings, perhaps more modest sanctuaries or even habitations, were erected adjacent or above them. The Layer 2 pillars are usually undecorated or only minimally carved, suggesting a shift in artistic style or function. This phase coincides with the pre-pottery Neolithic B, when farming and herding were gradually taking hold in the region. Thus it represents a transitional stage where the formerly nomadic groups might be settling down and their ritual practices were becoming more localized or integrated into everyday life. One of the most curious aspects of Göbekli Tepe is that these structures were intentionally buried by people who built and used them. Excavators found that the great circular enclosures of Layer 3 had been rapidly backfilled with a mixture of loose rocks, soil, flint tools, and animal bones. Sometime around 8000 BCE, the site's last users carefully filled in the remaining enclosures, effectively preserving them for 1,000 years, or even more, 10,000. Anyway, well, we do not know fully why. It could have been a ritual closing at the site, maybe. Perhaps a necessity if the place was no longer in use, and they wanted to seal it. But thanks to this Stone Age act of preservation, the megaliths and their carvings remained largely intact, sealed beneath the hill until our time, where we can rip them out of the ground. Well, to date, archaeologists have uncovered 4 large enclosures in the main excavation era, and partially exposed a few more. Geophysical surveys suggest that at least 16 to 20 enclosures lie buried across the mound's 9-hectare area. In other words, what we see now, as breathtaking as it is, likely represents only a small fraction, perhaps 5 to 10% of the total complex. Some have imagined a skyline of many stone circles crowning the hill in its prime. The sheer number of pillars identified, dozens have been excavated, hundreds more identified by scans, speaks of the scale of the undertaking that Göbekli Tepe really was. It wasn't just some random structure, but a whole aggregation of very specialized buildings, repeatedly built and rebuilt over many years. The site's plan was not an orderly grid, but rather seemingly organic clusters of circular rooms, a bit like a village of shrines, each perhaps with its own significance. And walking among the ruins today, under protective shelters that now cover them, one can gaze at the towering T-shaped pillars, some still standing upright in their original positions. They have a ghostly presence, as if stone beings are frozen in a kind of muted congregation of sorts. And indeed, the anthropomorphic quality of the T-pillars is one of Göbekli Tepe's most striking features. So let's turn to those pillars and the art carved upon them. We can get a few clues into the minds of the site's builders. So, the T-shaped monoliths of Göbekli Tepe are more than just structural supports. They are sculptures. And it's very clear that they had symbolic meaning. Now, the T shape is thought to be an abstract depiction of the human form. The pillar's upright shaft can be seen as a body, and the top crossbar resembles a broad, perhaps shouldered head. This interpretation is strongly supported by the fact that on some of the largest pillars, you can actually see carved arms, hands, and even belts with loincloths on the lower parts of the shafts. Well, for example, the 2 central pillars of enclosure D each have thin arms carved in low relief along their sides, hands meeting in front as if clasping the abdomen, and each pillar wears a belt and a loincloth depicted by relief carvings. Clearly, these great stones were meant to represent stylized humanoid figures, possibly ancestors, maybe gods, maybe mythic beings revered by the builders. It's hard to narrow it down, but certainly humanoid. They stand tall and impassive, facing one another in the center of each ring, like participants or officiants in some kind of eternal ritual. But beyond the humanoid pillar statues, Göbekli Tepe is famous for the rich iconography carved on the pillars' broad faces. Using flint chisels, Neolithic artists engraved an astonishing bestiary of the animal world they knew. In various enclosures, one finds images of wild creatures, lions or other big cats, leaping or snarling, foxes with their bushy tails, wild boars, aurochsen, that is wild cattle, with imposing horns, gazelles and wild donkeys, and a variety of small insects and reptiles, snakes, scorpions, spiders and insects, things like that. Birds are also prominent too, especially vultures, but also other birds like cranes, ducks or geese. One pillar shows that what appears to be a flock of long-necked birds, possibly cranes, in a row. On another pillar, a majestic vulture spreads its wings. These carvings are not random, though. Many are executed in high relief, standing out from the stone surface, An impressive feat of artistry for the Stone Age people. Pillar 27 in enclosure C, for instance, features a large predator, possibly a lion or a leopard carved in high relief, prowling down the side of the pillar. Pillar 18 in enclosure D carries a relief of a tall, slender fox, among other symbols. And even the socket stone at its base is decorated with a ring of carved ducks. The craftsmanship is skilled and standardized enough that one can sense an established artistic tradition at work. So who knows how long they'd been doing it. In any case, the symbolism of these creatures has been a matter of debate. Notably, many of the depicted animals are dangerous or wild animals, not the sort that one might primarily hunt for food. Well, we should be fair, gazelles and boar were hunted, but animals like lions, snakes, and scorpions evoke fear or reverence more than, getting something for dinner. And this has led some researchers to observe that the carvings evoke a scary and frightening world of beasts. Maybe they symbolize spiritual concepts, protective totems, clan symbols, even mythological figures. For example, in later Neolithic sites, we know vultures were associated with death rituals. Some early cultures practiced excarnation, that is, exposing bodies for vultures to consume as a way to liberate the soul. Göbekli Tepe's vulture imagery hints that similar practices or beliefs could have been present. A possible cult of the dead, where birds of prey have a role ferrying the deceased to the sky. Interestingly, art at Göbekli Tepe also includes representations of the human form in other ways. There are a few limestone sculptures found at the site. A particularly striking find is a life-sized human statue fragment, a head and a torso, discovered during the excavations, possibly representing a humanoid figure that might have been freestanding. Additionally, one relief on a pillar appears to show a depiction of a headless human with an erect phallus, being approached by a vulture and other creatures. Now, the scene suggests a narrative, quite possibly linked to death or ritual decapitation. Indeed, the theme of human heads, detached or trophy heads, that is, recurs quite a lot. Another pillar fragment carved in low relief shows a small human figure holding up what looks like a human head as if in offering. It's an eerie motive, sure, but it ties with the evidence that human skulls in death had special ritual treatment at the site. More on that shortly. The variety of symbols is not limited to animals and humans. Abstract symbols often appear. There are instances of the so-called H symbol, because it looks like a H. Yes. And there's other geometric signs on pillars too. On the benches and floors, archaeologists found odd limestone objects as well. For example, finely polished stone bowls, platters, and even a curious sculpted pole-like object nicknamed the totem pole, with stacked figures that might represent humans or animals merging into one another. A remarkable recent discovery in 2023 was a painted statue of a wild boar found at Göbekli Tepe. This limestone boar statue, about half a meter long, was found on a stone bench and still bore traces of red, black, and white pigment, making it one of the oldest known painted statues. It was accompanied by carvings of symbols like the H symbol, crescents, snakes, and human faces on the bench. The use of color in this sculpture reminds us that the people of Göbekli Tepe likely painted their carvings and pillars as well. The gray, beige stones we see today could have once been lively with reds, ochres, and whites, bringing out details in low light of dawn or dusk ceremonies. But what was the day-to-day life like at Göbekli Tepe? Well, intriguingly, all evidence suggests that people didn't permanently live on the site, so that makes it a bit difficult to tell. Archaeologists found an absence of domestic debris, no remains of houses or huts, no domestic hearths or ovens, no garbage middens or prolonged habitation, and no burials of ordinary folk, as often found in early villages. Instead, Göbekli Tepe seems to have been a regional gathering place, a sanctuary where people came temporarily, presumably for ritual activities, ceremonies, and communal feasts, and then they just dispersed back to their home settlements or camps. The evidence for feasting is especially overwhelming, scattered through the sediments that were used to backfill the enclosures. Researchers have recovered hundreds of thousands of animal bone fragments. They analyzed over 100,000 pieces, and the zoo archaeologist Joris Peters found that over 60% of them were gazelle bones, with a substantial portion of wild boar, and the rest including wild sheep, red deer, and other game. Now these were all wild species, and that shows that Göbekli Tepe's attendees were hunters bringing in their kills. The bones often show cut marks from butchery and have been broken open, likely to extract marrow and then burned, indicating cooking or roasting. Such an abundance of bones, far exceeding what small transient groups would consume, implies large-scale feasting events. It appears that when people gathered at Göbekli Tepe, they slaughtered dozens, if not hundreds, of animals to feed the crowd. Perhaps that was the ritual celebration. But alongside meat, plant foods were on the menu. Though charred plant remains are scarce, perhaps due to poor preservation, the tools speak volumes. Archaeologists have unearthed an extraordinary number of grinding stones, mortars, and pestles at Göbekli Tepe. More than 7,000 grinding tool fragments were catalogued. These are the implements to process grain and other plant foods. Use wear analysis and microscopic residues on these tools confirm that cereals were heavily processed at the site, likely to make flour for bread or porridge, or to brew beverages. In fact, one compelling theory is that Göbekli Tepe's workers and pilgrims were fueled by some of the earliest beer brewed by humankind. Large carved stone basins or troughs found there, some capable of holding up to 150 liters, could have been used to mix and ferment grain mash. Chemical analysis have detected traces of oxalate, a byproduct of brewing in such vessels, supporting the idea that a kind of primitive beer made from wild cereals was produced. And one can envision a scene after long hours of quarrying stone or performing rituals, the participants finally sharing a decent meal of roasted gazelle and a bit of crude beer or gruel, dancing and celebrating their communal achievements. But the feasting was likely more than just indulgence. It was a social clue, a reward system. Anthropologists propose that competitive fasting in early societies served to mobilize labor and foster alliances. To undertake the heavy work of carving and erecting pillars, someone had to organize a workforce and motivate them. Throwing grand feasts is one way to attract people from far and wide to contribute labor, and to cement social bonds among the disparate groups. At Göbekli Tepe, the feasts may have coincided with seasonal gatherings, perhaps at particular times of the year, when certain game was plentiful, or when harvests of wild grain could be collected. And indeed, analysis of wild gazelle bones suggests that many were hunted in late summer and autumn, possibly when gazelle herds were migratory or most abundant. So you might speculate that annual festivals took place in the post-harvest season, bringing communities together to worship anew before the winter, a kind of Neolithic Thanksgiving. But what about the rituals themselves? While we lack written records of their beliefs, obviously, the archaeology hints at a few possible ceremonial practices. First of all, The emphasis on human-like pillars and the evidence of special treatment of human crania indicate that people of Göbekli Tepe venerated human remains in some way. Over 700 fragments of human bone have been recovered, and among these, scientists have identified portions of 3 human skulls that had been deliberately modified. These skull fragments bear deep linear carvings incised on the surfaces, and one has a small drilled hole. Analysis showed the cuts were made with flint tools after the individuals had died and their flesh was removed. There are cut marks from the de-fleshing as well. That's a hell of a word, isn't it? De-fleshing. Haven't heard that one before. Anyway, the modifications do appear to have been intended to prepare the skulls for display. Grooves could allow a cord to anchor around the skull, and the drilled hole, placed so the skull would hang upright, suggests they were suspended, possibly from the very T-pillars or rafters. This is a unique variant of a skull cult, a tradition found in some other Neolithic cultures where ancestors' skulls were kept and honored, or enemy skulls were displayed. At Göbekli Tepe, it seems that the crania were not plastered or decorated as seen elsewhere, but rather literally hung up, perhaps as sacred relics or trophies. One can imagine ancestral skulls watching over ceremonies, or skulls of revered shamans kept as sources of power. The art supports this too. A carving on a pillar depicts a human figure holding a severed head, and some of the small figurines show headless bodies too. The theme of decapitation and curation of heads was clearly part of the symbolic language at play. Next, we have a few words to say about offerings and sacrifice. The sheer amount of animal remains and the positioning of some special deposits hint that offerings were made. Certain animal sculptures, like the carved boar statue which was recently found, might represent totemic animals or sacrificial spirits. Possibly animals were ritually slaughtered as offerings to whatever deities or forces the pillars represented. The fact that wild rather than domestic animals were used could tie into a cosmological worldview, where wild beasts had a kind of spiritual potency to them. Next was the communal dance or processions. The open layout of the enclosures with benches around suggests that the participants may have gathered around the central pillars, possibly sitting or kneeling, while rituals enacted in the center. The presence of stone drums, a few percussion instruments have been hypothesized from objects, and the imagery of animals dancing or moving might indicate music and dance were part of the festivities. It's easy to picture people circling within those stone rings in ceremonial dances, perhaps wearing costumes or animal masks, maybe. Though that's speculation. It would align with many ethnographic parallels in later ritual traditions, though I would say that. Some researchers have wondered if the pillars or certain carvings align with astronomical events, such as star-rise positions or solstices. There is as yet no consensus or any specific alignment at Göbekli Tepe, but given the skyward location and later importance of celestial cycles to agrarian societies, it is possible that gatherings also had a calendar or cosmological significance. However, this remains unproven, and we have to approach it with caution. We can't project later practices onto those early people. Right, so the construction of Göbekli Tepe's monumental structures required quite a bit of ingenuity and collective effort. And you got to remember that the builders had no metal tools, no wheels, no beasts of burden. So then we're left with the question, how did they manage to quarry, shape and transport and erect stones weighing up to 20 tons? Well, first, The limestone bedrock at the site is relatively soft, at least by stone standards, and occurs in layered formations, which is an advantage for extraction. Archaeologists have located several stone quarry areas around the hill where pillars were cut from the outcrops. In fact, one quarry still holds an abandoned pillar blank, partially detached from the bedrock, measuring about 7 meters long. Seems the project was never completed, a frozen glimpse of a work in progress. The people likely used hard hammer stones, that is, blocks of harder rock like dolerite, which had been found on the site, to punch out trenches around a desired pillar shape, gradually freeing the monolith from the bedrock. Flint chisels and points were employed for finer carving and detailing the reliefs. The surfaces of finished pillars show the scrape and peck marks of these tools. Once a pillar was carved free, it had to be moved, even if only a few hundred meters from quarry to enclosure. Sliding a multi-ton stone was challenging. The builders likely leveraged simple machines, rolling out the stones on logs or dragging them on sledges over wet clay or vegetation to reduce friction. Teams of dozens of people with ropes could have hauled the pillars, and we can surmise that prior to major construction, the organizers would call in able-bodied folks from surrounding areas, a communal work party that might coincide with ritual obligations or feasting rewards for participation. Experiments have shown that with enough manpower and basic physics, surprisingly large stones can be moved in prehistoric contexts. Raising the pillars into an upright position was perhaps the trickiest task. In later megalithic sites, builders often dug a hole with a sloping ramp, dragged one end of the pillar in, and then levered it upright and packed the base. At Göbekli Tepe, each pillar stands in a slot or hole cut into the bedrock floor, suggesting a similar approach. The pit holds a pillar base while refilled debris secures it. Wooden scaffolding might have been used to help tilt and guide the stones upright. The community's effort in accomplishing this must have been enormous and probably ceremonial charged. And you can imagine, certainly, that erecting each pillar itself was a ritual act, perhaps accompanied by chants or celebrations when the stone finally stood firm, transforming into that towering humanoid presence. The successful building of Göbekli Tepe implies some sort of social organization. Whether there were dedicated architects or spiritual leaders who directed the works, this we cannot know for sure. It is plausible that a class of ritual specialists, proto-priests or shamans coordinated the design and rituals, while clan leaders mobilized their people for labor. What is striking is that this could be achieved in a non-state, non-agricultural society, and it suggests that shared belief and social networks were strong enough to get cooperative projects done without centralized government or economic hierarchy, though some level of hierarchy or leadership may have existed, if only temporarily, during these projects. But an intriguing aspect is the continuity and longevity of building at Göbekli Tepe. The site was not just built in one go. It rather evolved over centuries. The earliest circles might have been relatively smaller or simpler, and over generations the constructions grew more elaborate. Each new generation literally built on the old, burying earlier structures and constructing new ones, perhaps larger or in different arrangement, and this indicates that the site's importance was sustained for many human lifespans, implying that knowledge, how to carve pillars, how to conduct ceremonies, was transmitted over time. But it also suggests that the site may have served as a stable meeting ground that helped bind disparate groups into a broader cultural community with a shared tradition. The backfilling of enclosures, that also required coordination. Tons of material had to be gathered and poured in. Interestingly, the fill is full of artifacts, tools, debris, refuge from the feasts. It's almost as if, when closing a temple, they ritually entombed the last usage items in it, kind of like a time capsule for us. Well, this might have been a conscious act to decommission the sanctuaries, perhaps when they found that they fell out of use, or when a decision was made to consolidate a ritual in a new form, such as more localized shrines once villagers took over. It is tempting to think that as farming and permanent villages emerged nearby, the hunter-gatherer pilgrimage center lost its role, and thus the people buried it respectfully and just moved on with their lives. Now, one of the most profound implications of Göbekli Tepe is how it's forced scholars to reconsider the sequence of events in the rise of civilization. Previously, the textbook's explanation for the Neolithic revolution, the transition from agriculture and settled life from the hunter-gatherer society, was that first came farming, which produced food surplus, which then allowed humans to support large communities, specialized labor, leaders, and eventually religious elite and monuments. It was first villages, then temples, in short. And Göbekli Tepe's timeline just flips the script. Here we have monumental construction and presumably complex ritual organization before evidence of farming and permanent villages in the region. The archaeological record around Göbekli Tepe shows that within a few hundred years after the site's main phase, the first signs of domesticated livestock and crops appear in the surrounding area. For example, by about 8500 to 8000 BCE, nearby communities had begun domesticating local wild sheep, pigs, cattle, and were cultivating einkorn wheat. Genetic studies trace one of the earliest domesticated wheat strains to just 20 miles from Göbekli Tepe. Now that's a coincidence, isn't it? Well, this tight chronology has led archaeologists like Schmidt to propose a radical theory. And it goes like this. Perhaps it was the effort of creating sites like Göbekli Tepe that spurred the need for agriculture in first place, rather than agriculture enabling people to create a site like Göbekli Tepe. Well, the logic is as follows. To build and maintain Göbekli Tepe's monuments, large groups of people had to gather and work together. These workers and pilgrims needed ample food, reliably, and maybe in quantities beyond what simple foraging could provide on short notice. The planning of regular, large feasts could have created an impetus to begin cultivating grain, to have enough for bread or beer, and managing herds of game, eventually domestication to ensure a steady supply of meat. So in essence, the social and spiritual needs might have driven economic innovation. The people had motive to start planting seeds of wild cereals in convenient plots, or penning captured wild sheep, gradually leading to domestication to support their ritual life. This theory finds some support in the evidence of extensive cereal processing on the site. Clearly, plant food was central at Göbekli Tepe. Perhaps beer or bread was needed in ritual amounts that wild gathering alone could not guarantee each season, nudging people toward proto-farming behaviors. Now, while this temple first, farming second hypothesis is still debated, it certainly gained credibility, and shows that ideology and social structures can be catalysts for technological change. Human groups might have come together for sacred purposes, and in doing so discovered new ways of living together, eventually becoming permanent settlers. But it is important to note that Göbekli Tepe was part of a larger cultural development, often termed the Neolithic transformation in the Near East. Multiple sites in southeastern Turkey and northern Syria from this era show precocious features: communal structures, artistic expression, intensive gathering of wild grains, etc. For instance, a site called Neva Kori, which we mentioned, now submerged by a dam, excavated in the 1980s, had a Neolithic village with a special building containing smaller T-shaped pillars, almost like a mini Göbekli Tepe within a village. Now this suggests that the concept of T-pillars, and perhaps what they stood for, was actually widespread among early Neolithic communities of the region. Göbekli Tepe, however, was not a village. It stands out as a central sanctuary, perhaps serving multiple bands or communities who shared a faith or at least a tradition of meeting to worship and feast. So in a way, Göbekli Tepe might represent the communal cooperation that prefigured civilization. By coming together in ritual projects, these groups may have forged broader cultural identities that eventually made larger social units, villages, towns, eventually cities, and so on, viable. The cooperation needed to raise a monolith parallels the cooperation needed to, I don't know, irrigate a field or build a well, something like that. Thus, we see at Göbekli Tepe the early forms of organized labor, planning and social hierarchy all coming together that later settlements would exhibit in full. But it's important to note that not all archaeologists interpret the site in the exact same way. It's very rare you'll get a complete agreement on this. A few have suggested alternative views. For example, could Göbekli Tepe have been a settlement after all, but with houses that doubled as sanctuaries? One scholar argued that perhaps those temples were actually large communal houses adorned with symbolic art, meaning ritual and daily life were intertwined rather than separate. But I don't believe it, because the lack of domestic evidence makes that very unlikely. How could they live in a house and not have any hearths? How could they not have any grinding stones? It's just, yeah, I don't think so. I mean, that's my opinion. Maybe you have your own opinion, I'm not sure. In any case, it makes it less likely. Though it might apply to smaller contemporary sites, but maybe not Göbekli Tepe. The consensus in general leans strongly to Göbekli Tepe being a primary ritual center. But don't write all the theories off. You see, maybe there's a lot more left to discover. In any case, for the general public, Göbekli Tepe has been a source of fascination, and I think it'll be one of speculation for quite a long time. It's got nicknames like the world's first temple, even linked to fanciful stories like the Garden of Eden in some popular media. But such things are not really taken seriously by scholars. In 2018, it was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognizing its outstanding universal value to human history, and tourism to the site continues to grow. They got a walkway, protective roofing too, to allow visitors to peer into enclosures A, B, C, and D, without worrying about damaging them. As for the T-pillars, they've almost become an icon of Turkey's prehistoric heritage, just as much as Stonehenge is for Britain, the pyramids are for Egypt, the ziggurat is for in Iraq. Perhaps not prehistoric, but they certainly go back quite a while. I think Turkey at the moment is taking the crown for the oldest monuments. And the local communities too, they've embraced the site's fame. Even local imagery and souvenirs celebrate the carved animals and pillars. So one could say that after 10,000 years, Göbekli Tepe is once again a gathering point. But this time it's not just for people walking from their little hunter-gatherer camps and all the rest. It's for people all over the world. And this time, we have tourists, scientists, archaeologists, news crews, a little bit of everything and everyone, all drawn back to this very ancient temple. And of course, if you've been to Göbekli Tepe, you have to tell us in the comments, don't you? You won't get away with it. You have to tell us all your story. Tell us what you saw. Tell us what you know. I don't want to be too aggressive. What I will do, though, is thank the patrons and supporters. Didn't get any ads, didn't you? That's pretty good. Well, it's all because of these fine people here on the top tier. I could read the lower tier ones, but we'd be here all day. They have my thanks as well. Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfednir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuro Nerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMS HH, Crystal, Talvery, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftus, Alexander, Gokan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Katie P, Boma, Kevin, Marissa, Altazakin, Lucy, Julianne, Rosie, Tivalo, Chris, Apocalyptic, Brandy, Wolfsbane, Dude, Prinny, Aiden, Fabian, or is it Fabian? Maybe Fabian, I don't know. Michael, Agworm, Prince of Persia, River, and Indian Trail. All right, well, that's all the top tier patrons. And that is us done for tonight. And yeah, I think it's time for a bit of a rest, I think. I am done for the evening, and I hope that your evening is winding down as well. Or perhaps you're listening in the morning, though I assume this is an evening activity for most of you. Well. All right, that's enough. I'll stop rambling. Good night. Lots of love to you all, and I will see you in the next video. Farewell for now.